We fret too much about minor hazards, improbable air crashes, carcinogens in food, low radiation doses, and so forth. But we and our political masters are in denial about catastrophic scenarios. The worst have thankfully not yet happened. Indeed, they probably won't. But if an event is potentially devastating, it's worth paying a substantial premium to safeguard against it, even if it's unlikely, just as we take out fire insurance on our house. As I said in my book, we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. There may be setbacks to our society. Indeed, a 50% chance of a severe setback. But are there conceivable events that could be even worse? Events that could snuff out all life? And by the way, our special aversion to the risk of truly existential disasters depends on a philosophical and ethical question. And it's this. Consider two scenarios. Scenario A wipes out 90% of humanity. Scenario B wipes out 100%. How much worse is B than A? Some would say 10% worse. The body count is 10% higher. But I claim that B is incomparably worse. As an astronomer, I can't believe that humans are the end of the story. There's 5 billion years before the sun flares up, and the universe may go on forever. So post-human evolution, here on Earth and far beyond, could be as prolonged as the Darwinian process that led to us, and even more wonderful. And indeed, future evolution will happen much faster, on a technological timescale, not a natural selection timescale. So we surely, in view of those immense stakes, shouldn't accept even a 1 in a billion risk that human extinction would foreclose this immense potential. Some scenarios that have been envisaged may indeed be science fiction, but others may be disquietingly real. It's an important maxim that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And in fact, that's why we at Cambridge University are setting up a centre to study how to mitigate these existential risks. It seems it's worthwhile just for a few people to think about these potential disasters, and we need all the help we can get from others. Because we are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, a planet with 50 million centuries ahead of it. And so let's not jeopardize that future. And I'd like to finish with a quote from a great scientist called Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They are attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they do not make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.
We are risking our existence. And if that's not a cheery way to spend your Sunday afternoon, I don't know what is. I think you'll agree, though. You turn on the news, you open a newspaper, and the consensus seems to be that things are going pretty well out there. The suggestion that there's some kind of existential risk is obviously mad and crazy. Luckily, a philosopher and astrophysicist and a software engineer walked into a bar. And in that bar, they formed something called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Our two guests on stage with us today are both from that centre, and we'll be talking about the nature of the things that should make us very afraid. But before I get to them, we're going to hear from their colleague, the aforementioned astrophysicist, Martin Rees.
I'm glad to be joining with Hugh Price and Jan Tallien and others in Cambridge in setting up a centre to study how to mitigate existential risks. Some scenarios that have been envisaged may indeed be science fiction, but others may be disquietingly real. We are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos, a planet with 50 million centuries ahead of it. Let's not jeopardize that future.
An impressive, charming man whose every utterance is designed to make us terrified. How nice that is. His two colleagues join us today. We're going to hear a short presentation from each of them, and then we're going to bring it together for a bit of a conversation where I try to get to the bottom of whether flesh-eating viruses or sentient robots are the thing that should make me more afraid as I go about my business. And we're going to kick off with Hugh Price. Hugh is the aforementioned philosopher. He's Bertrand Russell He's Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge and one of the co-founders of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Please make him very welcome.
So when I got to Cambridge, as soon as I ran into Martin, I spoke to him about this TALIN project, as I was calling it ambiguously at that time. And then, with his encouragement, I set out looking for a good way to bring Jan to Cambridge. And I found enthusiastic support at an excellent little centre called the Centre for Science and Policy in Cambridge, who invited Jan to come and give a public lecture in their Distinguished Lecture Series, and that happened early in 2012. And that was the first opportunity for Martin, Jan, and I all to meet together. And by spring of that year, we decided to work together to establish what we decided to call the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, or CSER, or CSER, as we say. So let me say something about the focus of CSER, of our project. We decided to focus explicitly on catastrophic, potentially species-threatening risks arising as unintended consequences of new human technologies. Now, of course, there are other extinction-level risks to our species, such as asteroid impacts or megavolcanoes. But these risks are low, and they're constant, and they're comparatively well understood. So it seemed obvious where we should focus our efforts. Now, we realize that some people would think of some of these concerns as a little bit flaky. But as Martin put it in one of our early conversations, that's precisely why they're so important. A lot of the danger here lies in the possibility that really serious risks are being ignored because they have this flaky image. So from the beginning, we set out to change that image, and we knew that our main weapon in order to do so was scientific reputation. We had to show that serious people took these issues seriously in order to push them towards the mainstream. And we've now been joined by a very remarkable group of academics and entrepreneurs who make up our advisory board and who've all been generous enough to lend us their names and reputations in support of what we're trying to do. It's a long list now, but just to mention a few names that will be familiar to almost all of you. I think there's Stephen Hawking, there's Bob May, Lord Mayor of Oxford, this distinguished physicist and ecologist who grew up here in the eastern suburbs, went to Sydney Boys, and was president of the Royal Society immediately before Martin. There's Alison Gopnik, the famous Berkeley psychologist and author. There's Max Tegmark, the MIT cosmologist, who told me 2 years ago when he joined us that we could use his name, but he was afraid that he didn't have any time to get involved in any way, but who's now, 2 years later, setting up a similar center of his own at MIT, with which we're now busily collaborating. And most recently of all, just about 3 or 4 days ago, there's Peter Piot, who's the Belgian microbiologist who's now director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, formerly director of the UN AIDS program, and who was co-discoverer of the Ebola virus in the 1970s. And it also occurred to me that this would be a very fitting role for the new Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy. As most of you will know, Bertrand Russell himself spent the last 20 years of his very long life trying to reduce risks of human extinction from nuclear war. So there's Russell at the age of 90 in 1962 on the cover of Newsweek, very much the intellectual grandfather of the ban the bomb movement of the time. CSER is built on the conviction that our best hope of surviving our own technological success lies in turning our scientific talents specifically to the task, in designing the techniques we apply to it like a piece of intellectual technology for the job they need to do. So that's our project at CSER. Here's our webpage. You can find us at CSER.org. Please go there and look us up. And thank you.
As we heard, Jan Tallinn is one of the founding engineers, the founding engineer of Skype, also of CSER, and a co-founder of MetaMed, which is a personalized medical research company. Please join me in welcoming Jan Tallinn.
The problems humanity is facing from AI and other powerful technologies are real, complex, and urgent. The problems are real because there are highly motivated teams around the world pushing the envelope of potentially dangerous science and technology. The problems are complex because they entail a risk of global runaway processes, that is, processes like global warming only acting on much shorter timescales. In order to mitigate them, we need to line up a lot of ducks in a row. And as attested by global warming, that's not something that we are very good at yet. Finally, the problems are urgent because it's not clear how much time we have left to address them. Now, to give you an analogy, imagine boarding a plane and being told that one bunch of officials believe there's a bomb on board, while another bunch of officials disagree. Would you be complacent about it, or would you rather get off? It gets worse, though. Complacency advocates rarely have arguments that hold up upon closer inspection. Indeed, such arguments often indicate that the person is simply not familiar with the current thinking. In 1939, most physicists, including famous ones like Einstein and Fermi, thought that nuclear reactions were impossible. Yet the first man-made nuclear reaction was just 3 years away. Not to mention that we might end up building the first human-level AI without actually fully understanding it first, just as evolution managed to build us. So being complacent about the outlook is the last thing that we can afford to do. Luckily, there are several positive trends that make me optimistic. First of all, even though the technology risk arguments are not new, I.J. Good made his prediction in 1965. Bill Joy wrote his famous article called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us in 2000, and Bernard Russell made his arguments somewhere in between. Up until recently, they were mostly dismissed as science fiction. Now that seems to be changing now, and I'm happy to have had a hand in this. And I sometimes joke that even though the Cambridge Centers for the Study of Existential Risk hasn't accomplished any research yet, it has already made a valuable contribution to the world. Because the Institute includes a number of people who are very hard to dismiss, it provides a canonical answer to the question, existential risks, says who? Also, the tone of the press is changing. A typical headline just 2 years ago was, "Terminator Center to open at Cambridge University," whereas a recent Bloomberg editorial was entitled, "Intelligent Machines Scare Smart People." What's more, the number of people working on these issues has been steadily increasing, as have their budgets. My own initial $4,000 donation to MIRI has grown to over $700,000 to 9 organizations this year. However, there's no reason to be content just yet. Still, as few as 20 people work full-time on these topics, and the amount of money humanity spends on its own survival even pales in comparison to what it spends on lipstick research. We also need to spread the culture of caution among leading researchers and technologists. After all, taking risks goes from heroic to irresponsible. So in conclusion, I would like to leave you with an image. If you Google the unlikely phrase NASA rocket frog, you should find a famous photo from about a year ago. It depicts a NASA rocket launch with a black silhouette of a flying frog visible against the glowing fumes. When I first saw the photo, it struck me as a perfect visual metaphor for what it means to share a planet with superintelligence. From the perspective of the frog, that event must have been sudden, strange, brief, and most likely lethal. To avoid the fate of that frog, humanity needs to get this act together now. And I'm increasingly confident that we can do it. Thank you.